Back down here in my basement workshop, and it's been a little while since I've been down here. In fact, it's been about 2 months. The last project I worked on was the Knotty Pine table, and today I'm starting a new project, something that I've wanted to do for some time. This project is going to be a frame for a mirror, and I want it to be an oval, or in other words, an ellipse. 42 years ago, I was in high school. Freshman in high school. It doesn't seem like it's been that long. I had Brother James for algebra in my freshman year and Brother James for geometry in my sophomore year. And he told me one day this was going to be important. And I didn't believe him. And I've gotten through 42 years and haven't needed it. And with all due respect to Brother James, I still don't need the algebra and geometry to do this. There is an algebraic equation to figure out the geometry, or an algebraic and geometric equation to figure out the geometry of an ellipse. And this goes on for 11 pages, but this is how it starts. And it goes on for 11 pages. And my mathematician, Rebecca, she's not here. She's in New Orleans with her fiance and his family. So I've got to figure out how to do an ellipse. And I've come up with a couple of ideas. Let me show you. First one is an old tried and true one. And it goes something like this. You take a piece of string, and between the string you put a couple of nails. And you stretch that string out. And after you stretch it out, you take a pencil, trying to do this one-handed, and you essentially draw your ellipse. And you can see that it's a little wobbly. Now you can work on that and make it much better, and a better string and better nails, and that'll improve it. But I actually have another technique, and let me show you that here in just a minute. As I've told you many times before, woodworking is a lot about making jigs. And here's an example. This is an oval cutting jig. And essentially what I have is a method of attaching my router to this jig and this part of the jig. And by connecting the major axis and the minor axis of the oval, I can spin this on here, and these will move back and forth, creating a nice oval. I'm going to put it together and show you how it works. So you're looking down on the jig now, and it's completely assembled. And it works okay. And therein lies the problem. If you, I've got the major axis of the ellipse and the minor axis of the ellipse. I've screwed the jig down to the wood, and then because these are opposed, it's going to, well, you'll see as I go through. As I begin to rotate it, and this is what I mean by it works okay. There you go. You can see that as I rotate it, I've got a spiral cutting bit on the router, and that spiral cutting bit will cut a nice clean groove in the plywood, and I'm going to cut the plywood. But the problem is that it jerks around just a little bit when it comes to the intersection. That one was smooth, but as I continue coming back, well, that one was smooth too. But there you go, you can see it sticks right there. And sometimes it sticks, and every time it does, that cut is no longer a smooth cut. That actually would have been pretty good all the way around, but it's not consistent enough for it to be completely useful. I'd probably waste a great deal of plywood in trying to create this. But the jig works. I mean, you can see that. The major axis followed by the minor axis and back again. So, proof of concept is good. The execution, though, leaves just a little something to be desired. I could probably make it work. But in the meantime, I found another jig, and this is a commercially manufactured one. And let me show you that one. And here's the jig. This jig is by Rockler Woodworking. I'm not sponsored by them or anything. I just was looking for something that would work for me, and this was it. And I ran one test piece already just to make sure it would work, and it worked just as I had hoped it would. So I'm going to show you how smoothly this cuts. And I want it a 23.5 inch tall by 18.5 inch wide ellipse for my frame. Now that's the outer portion of it. I'll bring it in another 1.5 inches or so to get the thickness that I want. Let me show you how well this works. And there you have it. I don't even have to measure it because I know it's 23.5 inches long. Correction, it's 23 inches long by 18.5 inches wide. So what I'll do now is I'll continue to measure in and make a mark here and make a mark here at the distance that I want. I'll reset the jig and I'll make a second cut, and I'll show you that here in just a minute. I didn't have the router deep enough here, so I'm just going to take utility knife and I'll cut that. And we'll sand that up a little bit later. But there you go. That is exactly what we're looking for. And I'll show you why this is so important in the next couple of videos. But this is our template, and this is what we're going to use to create the frame. And it turned out pretty well. So I showed you how I cut the oval, the ellipse. The other thing I showed you was how to draw an ellipse using string and a couple of nails. And you can actually do that pretty well, make that work out really well. Like I said, use a better quality string. And then when you're done drawing the ellipse, if you can imagine, you just drill a hole or take a jigsaw and cut along the ellipse that you've drawn, and then you draw another one, drill a hole, and cut with a jigsaw. You might be wondering why I'm going through the trouble of creating a template, and the reason for that, I had said earlier, would become evident, and now's the time to actually discuss it. You can see that the template I've got broken up into 4 different sections, and each section is going to be cut out of a single piece of oak. Now I could glue oak up just like I have laid out here, and then I could put this on that ellipse cutting jig and cut out my frame directly from this. But that presents a couple of problems. For one, the wood is 3/4 of an inch thick, and I would have to do multiple passes in order to make that happen. And no matter how good the jig is, there's a little bit of chatter in it, so as I go around, I'm going to cut a little bit differently each time. The second reason is perhaps the most important reason, and that has to do with the grain. If you look closely, you can see that the grain is running in this direction. And that means that if I cut an oval out of this, I would have vertical grain right down here at the bottom, and that as well as the top, and that is an extremely weak joint. If you have any wood furniture, you may have seen cracks develop, and they always develop along the grain, and we're trying to mitigate against that. So one of the things is to create that pattern and then draw onto the oak the 4 pieces, and let me show you that. So here I've taken the time to lay out the 4 pieces, and this corresponds to 1/4 of the ellipse, and the next, and 3, and finally 4. And in each corner I have corresponding marks to tell me that this edge 3 will match up with this edge from panel 3 to corner 4, because this cut and this cut have to be exact. Now they're not going to be. They're not going to be exact. I will get them as close as I can, and then what I will do is partially assemble them, and I'll cut them both simultaneously together. But now, when we're at the bottom of the piece, and this is the bottom of the piece, you can see that the grain is no longer completely vertical. The piece will go in this direction, and I've minimized as much of the vertical grain as I can, and the same with over here. There's still some vertical in it, and if I had a wider piece, I would turn these a little bit more, but that should be enough to prevent that weak joint. And I will attach them with either biscuits or spline, and that will give me my oval shape. So I'm going to cut that out on the bandsaw. So that's what we're doing, to give you a general idea. we're cutting out each segment, and we will, or I will, joint this one to the next segment down here, and the same with up here. Now that's not perfect, that's nowhere near perfect, but what we'll do then, I keep saying we like I have a mouse in my pocket, is I will get a flush cutting router bit, and it will ride along the surface of the template. A roller bearing will ride along that, and the cutter will cut this flush with this. And that's what we're trying to achieve. So I've decided that I'm going to use biscuit joinery to put this together. And I've also decided that I'm going to double up on the biscuits. So there's our template sitting on top of our cutout pieces. And I'll take that off and set it off to the side for right now. And we'll take a look at what I'm talking about. So here's the cuts I make for the biscuits, and you'll notice that I've doubled up this time. So I'm going to have 2 biscuits at each joint, and that's hopefully going to help keep this secure. I was afraid that if I only put 1 biscuit in the middle that it might buckle one way or the other. So I'm going to give that a go and see if it works a little bit better. So what I'm doing now is I've put the template, attached it to the top of the blank, and I'm taking a router with a flush cutting bit and running it around. Now you can see down here is a bearing. This bearing will ride along the template, and it'll allow the bit to get in and eat out the material. And I got quite a bit of material in there, so I'm going to have to take my time, maybe do several passes in there. Less material over here, so that should go quick. And I'm just going to take my time with it and see how it goes. That looks pretty good. A couple of things happened that I'm not too thrilled about. Over here I got some tear out. Up here the biscuit that joins it is visible. I'm going to have to put a little bit of putty in there. And again, this is just an experiment, so we'll continue to work on this and see how it goes. But now I'm going to do the outside. I had the second oval glued up, and I put the template on it, and I was using the flush cutting bit to trim up to the template, and it was going along pretty well. I mean, I've got some sanding that I need to do, but that's to be expected and really not a big deal. But here's the problem. As I was doing this, the grain changes as you go along. You can see how the grain is, and up in here I had what's known as tear out. So here I'm trying to route flush with the template, and instead I ended up tearing out right in here, and that will have to be patched. And then after I patch it, I have to route out a rabbet in here, which is removing some of this material. So there's going to be very little of the patch holding in here, and it's really not the most ideal. So I think I'm done with this technique. I'm going to throw this technique away. I'm not going to use this technique anymore. And the technique that I had already decided not to use, I'm going to go back to and use it. And essentially what I'm going to do is build a rectangle and I will put a template on the rectangle and draw the oval on it. And then I'll come back with my jig and I will route out using a spiral cutting jig the ellipse or the oval, and we'll see how we do with that, see if we have better luck without tear out. And when I do that, I'm going to have to make multiple passes. And that was one of the concerns I had, was that with the multiple passes, I may end up having ridges. But I think at this point, that's a better option. I can sand ridges off, or even take one final sweep with a routing bit and just clean it up ever so slightly. And I think that'll be safer than what I'm doing. And the big thing here is I need to be able to replicate this. It can't be just a one-off thing where I can make one picture frame and, you know, a year later make another picture frame or mirror. I need to be able to replicate this multiple times and create, you know, multiple ovals that I can work with. I'm back at the project, and this one has really created some difficulty for me. And it all has to do with the grain. I've had, as you've seen earlier in this video, tear out when I've tried to flush cut the oval. So what I'm doing now is I've cut 4 pieces of wood with a 45-degree miter in the corner, and you can see that the grain here is running in this direction and the grain here is running in this direction, and I'm hoping to be able to make this cut without having any tear out. I'll need to cut here and here. The first cut went well. Every time I came to the miter, I could hear a little pop as the straight cutting bit transitioned from one piece of wood to the other. So I'm hoping that I can continue the next 3 cuts without any tear out. I'm going to go ahead and turn the camera off, because if I do have tear out, I'm just going to start cussing and swearing. But so far so good, and I'll show you what it looks like when I'm done. Finished with the routing, and it looks like it went all right. I still had just the tiniest bit of tear out. I'm gonna have to think about that, but overall it went better than I expected, actually. So I'm gonna lift this off, and we'll see what we have here. Mark the pieces so I know what order to reassemble them. And there you have it. 4 pieces of the ellipse. Now I'll join them together with biscuits, and we'll see if we can finish this project. I've installed a rabbiting bit on my router, and you can see that there's a ball bearing here that spins, and then the router bit below it. This ball bearing runs along the workpiece, and then the cutter head actually removes the material from the workpiece. And this is the end result. I've cut about a 3/8 of an inch rabbet about 1/2 an inch deep in this oval frame. And what that will allow is the mirror to sit down, and I can bed the mirror on this shelf and then put a backer board across the top. And that's kind of what I've been going for. Now, this is my first attempt, and it didn't work out very well because you can see right down here there was some tear out. Well, I went ahead and made the repair, and I made the repair. You can see the grain runs in opposite directions. I did that on purpose to call attention to it so you could see that. But this is the overall effect of what the elliptical piece will look like. That was one method I used. The method that I just showed you on camera, where I used my oval cutting jig to make 3 separate passes for the outside cut and then 3 separate passes for the inside cut, that worked better. I still had just a little bit of tear out right in here, but it's not too bad. And this I'm using kind of as a proof of concept. My latest project's done. It's 2 oval frames that I put mirrors in. I used 2 different techniques to make these mirrors and found this one is the one I preferred and will use again. If you're interested in seeing the video, go to YouTube and search for Paul's Basement Workshop. The other frame I had trouble with and thought about throwing it out. As it lay on my workshop, I thought about the frame and the mirror that I was going to put into it. And I had a revelation. My daughter Emily and I talk about art, and some of her thinking seeps into my thick skull and takes root. We were at a museum in the modern art section, and on the wall was a painting in one color, one single color. It was a box, kind of like the artist Malevich's painting of a black box. There were other paintings like it, and I couldn't believe this was art. An artist named Rauschenberg painted 3 panels of white on white canvas. I'm not kidding. Emily was trying to explain why these pieces were important, and I guess they are for reasons that I just don't understand. I blurted out that this wasn't art, and she asked me what I thought art was. I told her if I can do it, it's not art. I've told this story before, but it's important for what comes next. That brings me to this frame. You can see it's darker, and down here at the bottom, you can see a patch. The trouble that I ran into with this frame. As I said, I thought about throwing it out, but I realized that I could patch it and use it for practice. I was going to use the same wood I cut this section from and align it with the grain and use a lighter stain in order to hide it. And that's where the revelation came from. I realized that when we look into a mirror, we look in the mirror to find imperfections and fix them. Here was an obvious imperfection, and instead of hiding it, I wanted to emphasize it. I wanted to show that even with our imperfections, we're all beautiful, and even with an imperfection, this mirror is beautiful. I hope you go to the YouTube channel, Paul's Basement Workshop, and see how I did this. Thanks for watching. Have a beautiful day.